Greetings and welcome to another episode of Canadian History Ehx. As Canada enters its 11th year and second decade of existence, many important events, births, and deaths would occur. Today we continue our look at Canada through the years with 1878. On January 22nd, Ernest Drury would be born in Crown Hill, Ontario. He would go on to found the Ontario Liberal Party and become its leader. This would lead him to become the 8th Premier of Ontario, serving from 1919 to 1923. Under his leadership, Ontario would introduce a minimum wage for women, a mandatory weekly day of rest, broaden workers' compensation, provide improved support for parents and children born out of wedlock, and he would allow for greater expansion of electrification of the province. He would also start the first major reforestation project in North America, and, most importantly, he would arrange for a grant to be given to two unknown men named Frederick Banting and Charles Best, the two men who would go on to discover insulin. On February 23rd, William Werman would pass away. He had served as mayor of Montreal from 1868 to 1871 after becoming one of the leading businessmen in the city through investments in railroads and banking. On March 7th, both the Université de Montréal and the University of Western Ontario would be incorporated. The Université de Montréal still exists to this day and counts government officials, academics, and business leaders as alumni. Currently, there are 34,335 undergraduates and over 11,900 postgraduate students attending the school. Some of the most notable graduates of the university include former Governor General Michel Jean, Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, and Robert Bourassa, former Premier of Quebec. As for the University of Western Ontario, which is in London, Ontario, and sits on 455 hectares of land, currently it has 24,000 students and 306,000 living alumni worldwide. Notable alumni include the aforementioned Sir Frederick Banting, astronaut Roberta Bondar, and John Robarts, former Premier of Ontario. On March 8th, Henri Gustavo Lotbiniere would become the Premier of Quebec, serving as the fourth person in that post. He was appointed after the Lieutenant Governor of the province dismissed Conservative Charles Boucherville from his position as Premier over proposed railway legislation. He then appointed Lotbiniere, a Liberal, as Premier. His tenure would be brief, though, from March 8, 1878 to October 31, 1879. Later in his life, he would serve as the 7th Lieutenant Governor of British Columbia from 1900 to 1906. He would pass away in Quebec City in 1908. To date, he is the only foreign-born person and Protestant to serve as Premier of Quebec. On April 14th, John Walter Jones was born in Prince Edward Island. He was instrumental in introducing potato crops to the island, which is now a staple of the economy there. In 1935, he received a medal from King George V for being the best farmer in the province. That same year, he was elected for the first time to the legislature as a Liberal. In 1943, he would become the 20th Premier of the province. During his tenure, which lasted a decade, he would repeal the strict prohibition on the province for alcohol, and he would join the Senate of Canada in 1953, passing away 1 year later. On May 1st, since no party had a clear majority, an election was called and the Conservatives would win a slim minority government in Quebec, but Lotbiniere was able to stay in power by forming a coalition of independents. He would be defeated in 1879 by the Conservatives. In June, the New Brunswick election was held only 1 month after John James Fraser had been appointed Premier of the province, after George Edwin King resigned. He would lead his government to victory. While there were no party labels, 31 MLAs supported the government, while 10 formed the opposition. On June 20th, Seymour Farmer was born. He would go on to become the 30th Mayor of Winnipeg, serving from 1923 to 1924, and eventually lead the Manitoba Cooperative Commonwealth Federation from 1935 to 1947. In all, he would serve in the Winnipeg legislature from 1922 to 1949, passing away 2 years later. On June 20th, British Columbia would host its election only 1 month after George Wacom became Premier of the province for the second time. Wacom would win the election and continue to serve as Premier until 1882. On July 23rd, James Thomas Milton Anderson was born in Ontario. He would go on to become the leader of the Conservative Party and find his way to Saskatchewan. From 1929 to 1934, he was the Premier of Saskatchewan, despite accusations that he was closely tied with the KKK that operated in the province for a brief time at that point. On August 15th, Thomas Laird Kennedy is born. He will go on to serve briefly as the 15th Premier of Ontario, while he will serve in the legislature from 1919 to 1934 and from 1937 to 1959. He was only Premier from October 19, 1948 to May 4, 1949. On September 17th, the federal election was held with Sir John A. Macdonald and his Conservatives going up against Prime Minister Alexander Mackenzie and his Liberals. This was a critical election as Macdonald had been forced to resign following the Pacific scandal several years earlier, relating to Conservatives taking money from deals related to the railroad. Unfortunately for Mackenzie, Canada had gone through an economic depression and the voters would punish his party for it. The policy of free trade supported by the Liberals was also not something many business owners in Toronto and Quebec wanted. Macdonald and his party would return to office after being defeated 5 years before over the scandals. The party would see an increase of 69 seats to 134, while the Liberals would lose 66 seats, falling to 63. That same day, the Nova Scotia election was held with Simon Hugh Holmes and his Conservatives winning a majority over Philip Hill and the Liberals. Holmes would be the fourth premier of the province and would serve until 1882. On September 18th, Billy Shering was born in Hamilton. He would go on to become the winner of the marathon race at the 1906 Olympic Games, taking the gold medal. Thanks to his win, 2 townships in Ontario would be named for him. He then quit athletics immediately and spent the rest of his life working as a customs officer until his death in 1942. The changes in leaders, something this year has a lot of, would continue, this time in Manitoba. John Norquay would replace Robert Davis in November of 1878, becoming the first premier of Manitoba to actually be born in the region that would become the province. He would survive the December election in Manitoba, barely winning his seat. Nonetheless, he would continue to serve as premier for the next 9 years in the province. On December 30th, William Aberhart would be born. He would become the premier of Alberta in a stunning upset in 1935. His government would be the world's first social credit government, but it would not be without controversy. Nicknamed Bible Bill for his strong religious beliefs, he would enact strict alcohol laws and would attempt to curtail the freedom of the press. He would serve until his sudden death in 1943. And you can also listen to the episode that I did on Bible Bill and the Press Act, which was released on Monday this week. It was also this year that British Columbia would succumb to anti-Chinese racism when the provincial government officially banned Chinese workers from all public work projects. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Canadian History Ehx, and if you did, please give it a rating and review. You can reach me at Canadian History Ehx, that's EHX, at gmail.com, and you can support the podcast at Patreon by going to patreon.com/Bairdo, that's Bairdo. Thanks, and we'll see you again next time.